All right, so we are moving on to the idea of carrying capacity and limiting factors. Carrying capacity and limiting factors really focuses on how an ecosystem functions and how the organisms within an ecosystem function. So, limiting factors are considered anything that limits how large a population can become. Those are all considered a limiting factor. So it can be the amount of space, it could be the amount of water, it could be nutrients. So anything that falls into those categories is considered a limiting factor. There's two types that we're going to talk about. The first one is density independent limiting factors. Those density independent limiting factors, it doesn't matter how big the population size is, it's going to impact the population negatively. So it doesn't matter how big. If there's a forest fire, it's going to negatively impact the same number of organisms than, if it was a small population versus a large population. So a flood, any natural disaster is considered density independent. Those have no, the size of the population, it doesn't matter at all. Whether or not it's a small population or a large population, there's still going to be a negative impact. Whereas density dependent, so think of it like our independent and dependent variables. If it's independent, it doesn't matter how big the population is, okay? If it's dependent, it means that if it's a larger population, it's going to have a more severe effect because there's more individuals. For example, if you have a disease spreading through a population, the larger the population is, the easier it's going to spread from organism to organism, and then it's going to impact more of the population. Same with water. So if there's a water shortage, the larger the population is, the more organisms are going to be affected because you have more individuals sharing that resource. So density independent, it doesn't matter the number there are, they're still going to be impacted. Density dependent, if it's a higher population or larger population, it's going to be more negatively impacted than if it was a smaller population. Nutrients are a great example of limiting factors. So nutrients are naturally cycled through the atmosphere, so the air, the atmosphere that we live in, the geosphere, which is the earth portion, and the biosphere, which is the life portion. So carbon is one of the best examples that we have. All of these cycles, called biogeochemical cycles, provide essential nutrients for organisms. Without these essential nutrients, without carbon, living things couldn't build other macromolecules, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. But there are naturally occurring cycles. The cycle of photosynthesis and cellular respiration are the two key naturally occurring processes that make up the carbon cycle. So photosynthesis cycles carbon from the atmosphere and attaches it into plants, and then plants utilize that carbon dioxide to create their own sugars, and then when animals eat those plants, cellular respiration happens, and then the animals use the carbon that they've taken from the plants to make their own macromolecules like proteins and sugars and fats and things like that. So without those two cycles, you wouldn't pass those carbon dioxide and oxygen molecules through the atmosphere, because the plants, they attach the carbon to the earth by using them in photosynthesis, and then the animals, when they go through cellular respiration, they breathe back out the carbon dioxide that the plants are going to use in. So that's the naturally occurring cycle that keeps carbon at a usable level for humans and other animals, not just humans. We're not the only organisms on the earth. The other biogeochemical cycles that are very important are, like I said, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle. Without nitrogen, we couldn't make proteins, we couldn't make DNA. The water cycle, we need water, all living things need water, and especially for the processes of photosynthesis and cellular respiration and building molecules in our system, and we'll talk about that too a little bit later. The sulfur cycle and the phosphorus cycle, those are all essential nutrients that living things need to survive, and humans actually negatively impact all of those cycles. Humans negatively impact the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the water cycle, the sulfur cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. So humans naturally impact, naturally they create waste that produces a negative impact on those cycles. So in an ecosystem, you have something called a carrying capacity. You have a carrying capacity that says this is the number of organisms that this ecosystem can support in a sustainable way. So if you take a look here, here's your carrying capacity. Let's say it's 1,000 sheep, okay? 1,000 sheep. If the population goes above this carrying capacity, what's going to happen is the sheep are going to start running out of resources. And when the sheep start running out of resources, they're going to start dying off. Then the sheep population is going to dip down below this carrying capacity. The ecosystem will stabilize. So the resources will rebound, the food that they eat, the water, all of those things will rebound. And then the sheep population will go back up to that carrying capacity. Most organisms hover around the carrying capacity, and there are some organisms that overshoot the carrying capacity, meaning they go way above the carrying capacity and then they drop back down. So most species, especially larger species, they're going to hover at that carrying capacity, and they're going to keep this S-shaped curve that we see here, slow growth, fast growth, and then they're going to stay here at this stable equilibrium. So carrying capacity is dependent on those limiting factors that we talked about, dependent on the food that's available, the nutrients that are available, the space, all of the things that organisms need to survive are considered limiting factors. Some factors are more limiting than others, but all the requirements of living things are considered a limiting factor. Ooh, easy for me to say. So if we have healthy cycles, healthy ecological relationships, and stable niches, that creates what we call biodiversity. And biodiversity is the variety of life on Earth. When we have biodiversity, that's very good. It means ecosystems are stable and they can survive and thrive and carry on and support lots of organisms. As ecosystems decline, meaning resources go away, meaning humans are negatively impacting those ecosystems, then the populations of species decline. And when the populations of species decline, we see a loss in biodiversity. Okay, so a loss in biodiversity is going to negatively impact populations. And my slide won't go back, and I don't know why. Oh, maybe I can squeeze it over here. Yes, okay. So as biodiversity declines, we see these ecosystems failing, and as the ecosystems fail, then we start seeing rapid collapse and extinction of species. So all of these things tying together create these tragic impacts on natural ecosystems. And humans, unfortunately, negatively impact these systems by deforestation, by pollution, and those impact species. Those species that are impacted are then going to cause those biodiversity declines and ecosystem failures. Okay, that's all we have, and we will see you for the next one.